Can arrogance and wealth protect him from justice? Or will the law prove that no one is above it? Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow we'll bring you another inspiring story, tailor-made for you. This story will be unlike anything you've imagined and will leave you speechless. Thank you for following our story. If you enjoy poignant and meaningful stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the surprises ahead. The story begins: arrogance, deception, and a spectacular downfall. Watch how one man's wealth cannot save him from justice. The courtroom buzzed like an agitated beehive. Tension crackled in the air. People crowded the benches, shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the defendant's table. Whispers spread from mouth to mouth, each rumor more scandalous than the last. Then he walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in a charcoal gray designer suit. The man exuded an almost arrogant confidence. His hair was slicked back under the fluorescent lights, and he smirked at the crowd as if the entire room had gathered to admire, not judge him. Blake Grayson, the name that had dominated headlines for weeks, looked more like an honored guest than a defendant accused of embezzling millions from struggling families. But it wasn't his appearance that turned heads. It was what happened when Judge Lee entered the courtroom in her black robe that was truly remarkable. Judge Lee moved with a quiet authority as she approached the bench. She didn't need to speak or glance at the crowd to command respect. Her presence was enough. Her reputation preceded her. A no-nonsense judge who valued justice above all else. All rise for Judge Lee, the bailiff announced, and everyone stood, except Blake Grayson. He remained seated, his eyes locked on Judge Lee with a defiant smirk. A collective gasp swept through the room. Judge Lee paused, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you will rise for the court." Grayson chuckled softly, a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I don't think I will," he replied, his voice laced with arrogance. "I'm not used to standing for anyone." Judge Lee's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, anger, disappointment, crossed her eyes. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice now edged with steel, "this is not a request. It's a court order." Grayson leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "And what are you going to do if I don't?" Judge Lee didn't hesitate. "Bailiff," she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom, "escort Mr. Grayson to the holding cell. We'll give him some time to reconsider his decision." Two burly bailiffs approached Grayson, who finally seemed to realize that this was not a game. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief. "You can't do that," he exclaimed. "I'm Blake Grayson. I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Grayson," Judge Lee replied, her voice cutting through his protests. "And in this courtroom, you are subject to the same rules as everyone else." Grayson was led away, still protesting, as the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Lee waited for the room to quiet down before continuing. "Let this be a lesson to everyone," she said, her voice resonating with authority. "No one is above the law, and in this courtroom, respect for the law and for the judicial process will be enforced." The trial continued, and Grayson's arrogance seemed to have deflated. He sat quietly, his eyes no longer defiant, but filled with a newfound understanding of the power of the law. Everyone stood, except for Blake Grayson. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the defendant, who remained seated, casually flipping through a legal document as if the proceedings were a minor inconvenience. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Blake waved him off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Judge Lee paused at her bench, her gaze sharp. Her face was unreadable, but the silence grew heavier with each passing second. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sense of disbelief palpable. Who does he think he is? But Blake remained unfazed. His expression was one of smug defiance, almost daring the judge to react. "Please be seated," Judge Lee said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't address the disrespect directly, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The tension was no longer just palpable. It was suffocating. But this was just the beginning. Blake Grayson was about to learn a harsh lesson that even the wealthiest and most privileged are not above the law. Blake Grayson wasn't just rich. He was the kind of rich that made headlines. Luxury yachts, multimillion-dollar mansions on both coasts, private jets, and parties that rivaled those of A-list celebrities. His business empire, Grayson Investments, had once been hailed as a beacon of financial success. But behind the glitz and glamour was a darker truth. Grayson's rise to the top was built on deception, promising small business owners and middle-class families the opportunity to secure their futures. He persuaded hundreds to invest their life savings in his fraudulent schemes. Retirement accounts, college funds, even family inheritances vanished in the blink of an eye. The consequences were devastating. Families lost their homes, parents struggled to feed their children, and elderly couples faced the grim prospect of spending their final years in poverty. The fallout from his greed was vast and deep, but for Blake, it was just business. When investigators finally caught up to him, the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, and testimony from former employees painted a damning picture. Yet, even as the walls closed in, Blake remained confident. "They have nothing on me," he told his lawyers, his voice laced with arrogance. "I'm Blake Grayson. I'm untouchable." Grayson's trial became a spectacle. The media portrayed him as a modern-day Madoff, a symbol of unchecked greed and corporate excess. The public outcry was deafening, demanding justice for the victims whose lives had been shattered by his actions. But Blake remained defiant, even as he sat in court. His tailored suits and expensive watches a stark contrast to the pain and suffering he had caused. He saw himself as a victim of a witch hunt, a successful businessman being unfairly targeted by jealous rivals and a sensationalist media. As the trial progressed, the evidence against Grayson mounted. Witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the devastating impact of his crimes. Financial experts detailed the intricate web of deceit he had woven, exposing the lies and manipulations that had allowed him to steal millions. But even with the overwhelming evidence, Grayson refused to admit any wrongdoing. He maintained his innocence, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance, a scapegoat for the failures of the financial system. In his closing argument, Grayson's lawyer painted him as a brilliant businessman who had been unfairly targeted by disgruntled investors. He argued that there was no concrete evidence linking Grayson directly to the fraudulent schemes, and that the prosecution's case was based on speculation and innuendo. The jury deliberated for several days, the tension in the courtroom palpable. Finally, the verdict came down. Blake Grayson was found guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, a collective sigh of relief that justice had finally been served. But for Blake, the reality of his situation seemed to sink in slowly. As he was led away in handcuffs, his face was no longer one of arrogance and defiance. It was a mask of shock and disbelief. "I have the best lawyers money can buy," he told reporters outside his Malibu mansion. "This will blow over. It always does." And for a while, it seemed he might be right. His legal team filed motion after motion, delaying the trial for months. They painted him as a misunderstood businessman, a scapegoat for others' failures. But no legal maneuvering could erase the mountain of evidence or the heartbreak of his victims. By the time the trial finally began in San Francisco, the courtroom was packed every day, seeking justice, or at least something resembling it. Among them was Maria Martinez, a widowed mother of 3 who lost her home after investing in Grayson. Her youngest daughter had to drop out of college. Sitting beside her was Jack Vaughn, a retired firefighter who had spent decades saving for retirement, only to end up living in his brother's spare room. Their stories, and countless others, were shared in excruciating detail throughout the trial. Maria's voice choked as she described the day she realized she couldn't make her mortgage payment. "I begged them not to take my home," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But they didn't care. My kids had to sleep in our car for 2 weeks. Do you know what that's like?" Jack's testimony was equally harrowing. "I spent 35 years running into burning buildings," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "And this man, he burned my future to ashes without a second thought." Throughout it all, Blake sat there unmoved. He would often lean back in his chair, scrolling through his phone or whispering jokes to his lawyer. To him, these were just stories, irrelevant noise that wouldn't change the outcome he believed was already in his favor. The press ate it up. Newspaper headlines screamed about his arrogance, his lack of remorse, and the blatant disrespect he showed the court. Public opinion was turning against him, but Blake didn't care. Public opinion didn't write checks, as far as he was concerned. His lawyer tried to spin the narrative. Mr. Grayson is deeply sorry for any hardship that has been caused, the lawyer said in a press conference, but he remains confident that the truth will prevail. But the truth, as it often does, had a way of revealing itself. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including financial records, emails, and testimony from former employees, all of which painted a damning picture of Grayson's fraudulent activities. The jury deliberated for 3 days, the tension in the courtroom so thick you could cut it with a knife. Finally, they reached a verdict. Blake Grayson was found guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others wept openly. Maria and Jack embraced, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It wasn't the justice they had envisioned, but it was something. Blake's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion. It wasn't remorse or even fear. It was disbelief. He couldn't believe that his wealth, his power, his carefully constructed image had failed him. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at the courtroom, his eyes searching for something, maybe an escape route, maybe just a friendly face. But all he saw were the faces of his victims, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and a sense of closure. However, the truth was Blake had no intention of admitting guilt. He was betting on the system bending to his will as it always had. But this time, there was a factor Blake hadn't counted on. Judge Lee was unlike anyone he had dealt with before. The trial was a spectacle. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, reporters jostling for the best position, capturing every detail. Inside, the tension only escalated as the days dragged on. Witness after witness took the stand, each one hammering another nail into Blake Grayson's metaphorical coffin. But it wasn't just the testimonies that had the audience gasping. It was Blake's behavior. On the third day of the trial, the prosecution presented damning evidence. A series of emails where Blake explicitly ordered his team to falsify records and mislead investors. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor read his words aloud. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line." The words hung in the air like poison. Maria Martinez, sitting in the front row, shook her head in disbelief. Jack Vaughn clenched his fists. Blake, on the other hand, smirked. The prosecutor turned towards him, her voice sharp. "Mr. Grayson, do you recognize these emails?" His lawyer jumped in before he could answer. "Objection. This question has been asked and answered in pretrial hearings." Judge Lee raised her hand, her expression calm but firm. "Overruled. The defendant will answer the question." Blake leaned into the microphone, his tone dripping with disdain. "Yes, I recognize them. But don't pretend like they mean what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand." The crowd erupted in murmurs, and the judge's gavel came down like a thunderclap. "Order in the court," Judge Lee commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. She turned her attention back to Blake. "Mr. Grayson, I suggest you watch your tone. This is not a boardroom meeting." But Blake was unfazed. If anything, he seemed amused, as if this were all an elaborate game. As the trial continued, his arrogance only grew. He interrupted witnesses with snide remarks, rolled his eyes during cross-examinations, and whispered loudly to his lawyer during crucial moments. The audience watched in disbelief as he treated the courtroom like his personal stage. "This is a joke," he muttered to his lawyer, loud enough for a few reporters to hear. "They have nothing on me. It's all circumstantial." His lawyer nodded, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Even he seemed to realize that Blake's behavior was doing more harm than good. But Blake was too consumed by his own ego to see the writing on the wall. He was convinced that his wealth and power would protect him, that he was above the law. As the trial neared its end, the prosecution delivered its closing argument, a powerful summation of the evidence and the devastating impact of Blake's crimes. The prosecutor's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke about the victims, the families whose lives had been shattered by his greed. "This is not just about money," she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "It's about trust, it's about responsibility, it's about basic human decency. And Mr. Grayson has violated all of that." Blake remained stoic, his gaze fixed on the prosecutor, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He was still confident, even as the jury filed out to deliberate. But as the hours ticked by, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He paced back and forth in the holding cell, his arrogance slowly giving way to anxiety. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Blake stood before the judge, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room. The verdict was read, and the words echoed through the silent courtroom: "Guilty on all counts." Then came the day Maria Martinez took the stand. She walked to the podium clutching a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. Her voice was shaky as she began, but her words carried the weight of her pain. "I trusted him," she said, her eyes fixed on Blake. "I trusted him with everything I had, and he ruined my family's future." Blake didn't even look at her. He leaned back in his chair, casually scrolling through his phone. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, gesturing towards Blake, "the defendant is clearly not paying attention to the witness." All eyes turned to Judge Lee. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes burned with a quiet fury. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice measured, "put your phone away. Now." Blake glanced up, unfazed. "I'm just checking something important," he said, holding up the device as if to justify his actions. The judge's tone was firmer now. "I said now." For a moment it seemed like he might argue, but then, reluctantly, he placed the phone down. The tension in the room was palpable, but the damage was done. Maria's testimony continued, but her voice carried an unmistakable tremor, as if she couldn't comprehend such a basic lack of human decency. By the end of her testimony, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Blake's. The prosecution rested its case a week later, leaving the defense to make its move. Blake's lawyer tried everything: discrediting witnesses, twisting the narrative, even painting Blake as a victim of overzealous prosecutors. But the cracks were too big to cover up. Throughout it all, Judge Lee remained a picture of composure. She rarely spoke, but her presence filled the room like a steady, unwavering force. But it was clear to everyone watching that her patience with Blake's antics was wearing thin. The trial reached its final day. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Reporters filled the back benches, their pens poised and cameras ready. The gallery was packed with victims, their faces a mixture of anger and hope. All eyes were on Judge Lee as she prepared to deliver the sentence. Blake Grayson sat at the defense table, his posture as relaxed as ever. He even dared to smirk at the cameras as they captured his every move. He didn't look like a man about to face judgment. He looked like a man who believed he had already won. When Judge Lee finally spoke, the room fell silent. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice even and measured, "you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you was overwhelming, and the testimonies of your victims painted a clear picture of your actions. You manipulated, exploited, and destroyed the lives of countless individuals, all for your own personal gain." Blake leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. The judge continued, "Throughout this trial, you have shown a blatant lack of remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful. You have insulted your victims, shown contempt for the authority of this court, and treated these proceedings as if they were beneath you." The crowd murmured in agreement. Maria Martinez, sitting in the front row, clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. Judge Lee's tone shifted, becoming colder. "Justice, Mr. Grayson, is not about wealth, power, or privilege. It's about accountability, and today you will face the consequences of your actions." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers. Blake's smirk faltered for the first time as he straightened up in his chair. "Therefore, the judge declared, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps echoed from the crowd. Blake's face froze, the blood draining from his cheeks. 25 years? He had expected a slap on the wrist, maybe a few months in a comfortable facility, but this was unheard of for someone of his stature. Judge Lee wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I order the immediate liquidation of your assets to provide restitution to the victims of your crimes. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the families you devastated." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of astonishment. Maria Martinez raised her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Jack Vaughn leaned back in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Blake sat there, stunned, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. His carefully constructed world, built on lies and deceit, had come crashing down around him. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at the courtroom, his eyes searching for something, maybe an escape route, maybe just a friendly face. But all he saw were the faces of his victims, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and a sense of closure. Blake jumped up from his seat, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do this," he yelled, his voice echoing through the room. "I'm Blake Grayson. You can't treat me like a common criminal." Judge Lee's gavel slammed down, her expression unwavering. "Mr. Grayson, sit down." But Blake wasn't finished. "This is a joke. I'll appeal. I'll ruin your career." The court officers moved closer, ready to intervene. Judge Lee, still calm, her voice cutting through his outburst like a knife. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson, and you will show respect. Officers, escort the defendant out." As he was led away, Blake continued to protest, his voice fading with each step. The courtroom erupted in applause, something rarely seen but feeling entirely appropriate in that moment. Judge Lee turned to the audience, her expression softening slightly. "Justice has been served," she said. "Let this be a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." But as the courtroom emptied and the cameras outside began to flash, a question lingered in everyone's minds. Would this sentence be enough to truly change a man like Blake Grayson? The courtroom was almost empty, with only a few reporters and victims lingering to gather their belongings. The buzz of excitement still hung in the air, but for those directly affected by Blake Grayson's crimes, the emotions were more complex. Maria Martinez stood by the courthouse steps, clutching her purse. A reporter approached her with a microphone. "How do you feel about today's verdict?" Maria hesitated, then spoke. "I feel relieved, but the truth is, no sentence can undo the damage he's caused. My children and I are still rebuilding our lives, but at least now we have hope." Nearby, Jack Vaughn was talking to a friend. "It's not just about the years he'll serve," he said, shaking his head. "It's about the message. People like him think they're untouchable. Today proves them wrong." Inside her chambers, Judge Lee sat quietly, gazing out the window, down below. She didn't feel victorious or triumphant, just a quiet sense of resolve. Her role wasn't about personal satisfaction, but about ensuring fairness, about reminding everyone that the scales of justice can balance even against the weight of wealth and privilege. Here's the continuation of the story in English, maintaining the original emotional tone and nuances, with a focus on accurate American legal context and professional language. Blake Grayson's name would continue to grace the headlines for a while, but for those he had wronged, this chapter was finally closed. The financial restitution would help many of them start over, but the scars he had left would take much longer to heal. As the weeks passed, the story sparked conversations across the country. It became a rallying cry for accountability, forcing those in power to abide by the same standards as everyone else. People shared their own stories of injustice, drawing strength from the verdict, but perhaps the most powerful moment came from Maria's youngest daughter, Emily, who wrote a letter to Judge Lee that was later published in a local newspaper. "Thank you for standing up for my family," the letter read. Thank you for showing us that people, like Blake Grayson, can't get away with hurting people like us. You didn't just give us justice, you gave us a second chance. The story of Blake Grayson's trial wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a reminder of the resilience of ordinary people, the importance of integrity, and the belief that justice can and should prevail, no matter the odds. So, as you sit with this story, ask yourself, what does accountability mean to you? And in your own life, how can you ensure that fairness and justice are not just ideals but actions? Because ultimately, justice is not just the responsibility of the courts. It's something we must all strive for every day. What do you think about this story? Does justice always prevail, or are there still hidden corners? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinions can help us better understand the value of justice and fairness in society. If you find this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and loved ones. Together, let's spread the message of kindness, courage, and belief in justice. Thank you for your support. Let's work together to build a better society. Have a great day. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.